Hermann Göring was born in 1893 into a respectable upper-middle-class family in Bavaria. His father was a judge and diplomat who had served as governor of German Southwest Africa, and young Hermann grew up with a sense of entitlement and ambition. Unlike many Nazi leaders who came from more modest backgrounds, Göring had social standing and connections from birth. He served with genuine distinction in World War I as a fighter pilot, achieving 22 confirmed victories and receiving the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor. He commanded the famous Richthofen Squadron after the Red Baron's death and emerged from the war as a decorated hero. This military glory would be crucial to his later career, giving him credibility and prestige that other Nazi leaders lacked. After the war, Göring drifted through various occupations, including working as a commercial pilot and living in Sweden for a time. He met Hitler in 1922 and was immediately captivated by the future dictator's vision and charisma. Göring joined the Nazi Party and quickly became one of Hitler's most important lieutenants, commanding the SA stormtroopers in the early days. He participated in the failed beer hall putsch in 1923, was wounded by police gunfire, and fled Germany to avoid arrest. During his exile, he became addicted to morphine, which had been prescribed for his wounds, an addiction that would plague him for the rest of his life and profoundly affect his behavior and effectiveness. When Göring returned to Germany in 1927 after an amnesty, he resumed his association with Hitler and the Nazi Party. As the Nazis gained political power, Göring's combination of war hero status, social connections, and administrative ability made him invaluable. When Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, Göring was appointed to several key positions, including Prussian Minister of the Interior, which gave him control over the police in Germany's largest state. He used this power to establish the Gestapo and to consolidate Nazi control through terror and repression. In 1935, Hitler gave Göring perhaps his most important assignment: building the Luftwaffe, the new German Air Force. Creating a modern air force essentially from scratch was an enormous undertaking, as Germany had been forbidden from having military aviation under the Treaty of Versailles. This period from 1935 to 1939 represents Göring at his most effective and energetic, when his daily routine was dominated by genuine work building and organizing the Luftwaffe and managing various other responsibilities. During these dynamic years of the mid to late 1930s, Göring's typical day began relatively early by his later standards, usually around 8 or 9 in the morning. He would wake at Carenhall, his massive estate north of Berlin, named after his deceased first wife, Karin. Carenhall was an enormous hunting lodge and palace that Göring had built using state funds and his growing ill-gotten wealth. The estate reflected Göring's grandiose tastes, with its massive hunting hall decorated with looted art, its extensive grounds stocked with game, and its opulent furnishings. Göring's morning routine included dressing in one of his numerous elaborate uniforms, as he was notorious for designing his own fantastical military and ceremonial costumes that he would change multiple times per day. His vanity about his appearance was legendary, and he spent considerable time ensuring he looked impressive, even as his weight ballooned and his health deteriorated. Breakfast was usually a substantial affair, as Göring was already developing the obesity that would characterize his later years. He ate heavily and drank champagne even in the morning, beginning a pattern of overindulgence that would accelerate as the years passed. During breakfast, he would review reports and correspondence that his staff had prepared, getting briefed on overnight developments and the day's schedule. Even in these productive years, Göring's work habits were less disciplined than those of other Nazi leaders. He preferred working from his estates rather than going to offices in Berlin, and he structured his days around his comfort and pleasure rather than bureaucratic routine. By mid-morning, Göring would typically be engaged in meetings related to the Luftwaffe, which was his primary responsibility and greatest achievement. He met with aircraft designers, industrialists producing planes and equipment, Luftwaffe commanders discussing training and organization, and technical experts on various aspects of aviation and air warfare. During this period, Göring was genuinely engaged with the details of building the Air Force, making decisions about aircraft types, production priorities, training programs, base construction, and strategic doctrine. He drove the Luftwaffe's expansion with energy and vision, and while he made mistakes and allowed favoritism and corruption to undermine efficiency, he nonetheless succeeded in creating a formidable air force in a remarkably short time. These meetings about Luftwaffe matters occupied much of his morning and early afternoon during the 1930s. Göring also spent time on his responsibilities as Plenipotentiary of the Four-Year Plan, a position he was given in 1936 that made him effectively the economic dictator of Germany. The Four-Year Plan was Hitler's program to make Germany economically self-sufficient and prepared for war within 4 years. Göring's role involved coordinating industrial production, allocating resources, managing foreign exchange, and generally directing the German economy toward military preparation. This was an enormous responsibility, requiring coordination with industrialists, government ministries, party organizations, and foreign trade partners. Göring held meetings about production targets, resource allocation, synthetic fuel development, and numerous other economic matters. In the late 1930s, he was still relatively engaged with these responsibilities, though even then he delegated much of the actual work to subordinates, while keeping control over major decisions and using his position to enrich himself and his associates through corruption and insider dealing. Lunch for Göring was always a major production, reflecting his love of food and his need for luxury. He would host elaborate lunches at Karen Hall or at his Berlin residence, inviting industrialists, foreign dignitaries, other Nazi leaders, or artists and cultural figures. These lunches served multiple purposes. They were opportunities for business discussions and political maneuvering. They allowed Göring to display his wealth and power, and they satisfied his love of playing the grand host. The meals were lavish with multiple courses, fine wines and champagnes, and they often stretched for 2 or 3 hours. Göring enjoyed holding forth during these meals, telling stories of his World War I exploits, discussing his art collection, expressing his views on various subjects, and generally dominating the conversation. Guests learned that Göring expected to be the center of attention and that contradicting him or failing to show sufficient deference could have consequences. After lunch, Göring's afternoons in the late 1930s included more meetings and administrative work, though he was already showing signs of the laziness and self-indulgence that would become overwhelming during the war. He might meet with foreign visitors, as he often served as a diplomatic interlocutor for the Nazi regime given his social skills and relative polish compared to other Nazi leaders. He met with industrialists about production contracts, with party officials about various political matters, and with military commanders about rearmament and strategic planning. However, these afternoon working sessions were increasingly interrupted by Göring's personal interests and pleasures. He might break off from meetings to show visitors his art collection, to play with his model train set, which occupied an entire room at Caron Hall, or to go hunting in his private game preserve. Göring's passion for art collecting became an increasingly dominant part of his daily life, and the line between legitimate collecting and outright looting was non-existent. He spent considerable time viewing artworks that dealers brought to him, visiting galleries and museums, and selecting pieces to acquire, often through coercion or at absurdly low prices, from Jewish owners being forced to liquidate their collections. His agents scoured Europe for artworks to add to his collection, and Göring devoted hours to cataloging his acquisitions, having them appraised, and arranging them in his various residences. This art obsession reflected both genuine aesthetic interest — Göring did have knowledge of and passion for art — and his megalomania and greed, as he accumulated one of the largest private art collections in Europe through theft and exploitation. Late afternoon and early evening were often devoted to hunting, one of Göring's greatest passions. As Reich Master of the Hunt, he controlled hunting rights throughout Germany and maintained strict game laws that, ironically, he often violated himself. Göring's estates were stocked with deer, boar, and other game, and he would spend hours in the forest hunting, often accompanied by guests whom he wanted to impress. These hunting expeditions were elaborate affairs with beaters to drive game, professional huntsmen to assist, and all the trappings of aristocratic hunting traditions that Göring romanticized. After successful hunts, he would pose for photographs with his kills, adding to his collection of images that presented him as a great hunter and outdoorsman. Images that became increasingly absurd as his obesity made physical activity difficult. Evenings typically began with Göring changing into yet another elaborate costume, perhaps a velvet smoking jacket or a medieval-style hunting outfit, as he entertained guests for dinner. Dinner at Caron Hall, or his Berlin residence, was even more elaborate than lunch, with more courses, finer wines, and more ostentatious displays of wealth. Göring would again dominate conversation, and these dinners often included entertainment, such as private concerts or film screenings. Göring loved opera and theater and maintained boxes at major venues, attending performances regularly when in Berlin. He also enjoyed films and had a private cinema where he would watch both German productions and, secretly, Hollywood films that were officially banned. These evening entertainments reflected Göring's self-image as a Renaissance man and cultured leader, though his taste was more for spectacle and display than for genuine refinement. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s and Germany went to war, Göring's daily routine began to change in troubling ways. The discipline and energy of the earlier years diminished, and his vices increasingly dominated his time. When World War II began in September 1939, the Luftwaffe's role was crucial, and Göring should have been devoting himself entirely to commanding the Air Force in combat. Initially, the Luftwaffe performed well, supporting the rapid conquests of Poland, Norway, France, and the Low Countries. Göring basked in these successes and took credit for the Air Force's achievements. However, he was already delegating most actual command responsibilities to subordinates, while he enjoyed the prestige and privileges of his position. By 1940, during the Battle of Britain, Göring's deficiencies as a military commander became obvious. He made poor strategic decisions, insisted on tactics that his own commanders questioned, and failed to provide effective leadership as the Luftwaffe attempted and failed to destroy the Royal Air Force and achieve air superiority over Britain. Göring's daily routine during the Battle of Britain showed his detachment from the realities of combat. He would receive reports of the previous day's operations over breakfast at Hall or at his special armored train headquarters, holding conferences with Luftwaffe commanders where he would berate them for failures while refusing to acknowledge that his own strategic direction was flawed. He made increasingly unrealistic demands, insisting that his pilots achieve impossible results, and he began to lose credibility with his own air crews who bore the costs of his miscalculations. After the failure of the Battle of Britain, Göring's influence with Hitler began to decline, and his daily routine reflected his retreat into fantasy and vice. He spent less time on actual military matters and more time on his personal pleasures and interests. By 1941 and 1942, a typical day for Göring might begin not at 8 or 9, but at 10 or 11, as he stayed up late and slept later. His morphine addiction had returned in full force, and he was taking substantial doses daily, which affected his energy, judgment, and effectiveness. He would wake sluggish and irritable, requiring time and medication to become functional. His staff learned to avoid bringing him bad news in the morning, when he was at his worst. Morning meetings during the war years became shorter and less focused. Göring would receive briefings on Luftwaffe operations, but he increasingly refused to accept responsibility for failures and blamed his subordinates. As Allied bombing of Germany intensified from 1942 onwards, Göring's position became untenable because he had famously boasted that no enemy aircraft would ever reach the Ruhr industrial area or Berlin. And now Allied bombers were devastating German cities with impunity. Göring's response to this disaster was denial and retreat. He avoided Hitler, knowing that the Führer was furious about the Luftwaffe's failures. He stopped visiting Luftwaffe units as frequently because the reception from pilots and ground crews became increasingly hostile. Instead, he withdrew to his estates and devoted himself to the pleasures that could distract him from reality. Göring's art collecting became even more obsessive during the war, transforming into systematic looting on a massive scale. As German forces conquered territories across Europe, Göring used his position to acquire artworks from museums, private collections, and particularly from Jewish families, whose property was confiscated. His agents operated in France, the Netherlands, Eastern Europe, and throughout occupied territories, selecting the finest pieces for the Reich Marshal's collection. Göring would spend hours reviewing catalogs and photographs of available artworks, selecting pieces, and arranging for their transport to Germany. Trainloads of looted art arrived at his estates, and Göring devoted considerable time to examining his new acquisitions, cataloging them, and deciding where to display them. This looting operation was criminal and vast in scale, and Göring's personal involvement was direct and extensive, consuming much of his time and attention during years when he should have been commanding the air war. By 1943 and 1944, as Germany's military situation deteriorated catastrophically, Göring's daily routine had become a parody of leadership. He would wake late, well after noon on many days, having spent the previous evening and night drinking heavily and taking drugs. He had gained enormous weight, often exceeding 300 pounds, and suffered from various health problems, including heart issues. His elaborate uniforms had to be constantly adjusted to accommodate his expanding girth, and his vanity led him to wear increasingly ridiculous costumes, including togas and theatrical outfits that made him look absurd. When he did hold meetings about Luftwaffe matters, they were often unproductive sessions, where Göring ranted about betrayal and incompetence, while refusing to acknowledge the fundamental problems facing the Air Force, including catastrophic losses of experienced pilots, fuel shortages, and overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. Much of Göring's day during the final war years was spent in his private quarters at Karen Hall or his other estates, often in a drug-induced stupor or playing with his model trains. The model train layout at Karen Hall was enormous, occupying multiple rooms with elaborate landscapes, villages, and intricate track layouts. Göring would spend hours running his trains, adjusting scenery, and generally engaging in escapism while Germany was being destroyed. Visitors and staff reported surreal scenes of the Reich Marshal, dressed in bizarre costumes and heavily medicated, playing with toy trains, while Allied bombers destroyed German cities and Soviet armies advanced on multiple fronts. This retreat into fantasy was Göring's psychological response to failure and to the collapse of the regime he had helped build. Meals remained important to Göring even as most Germans faced severe rationing and hunger. He continued to eat lavishly, having food brought from his estates, which were stocked with game, produce, and luxury items unavailable to ordinary Germans. He drank expensive wines and champagnes while discussing art or telling increasingly repetitive stories of his past glories. His household staff maintained the fiction of normalcy, serving elaborate dinners on fine china and maintaining the routines of peacetime luxury, even as the war reached Germany's borders. This disconnect between Göring's continued indulgence and the suffering of the German population was obscene and reflected his complete moral bankruptcy. Göring's responsibilities for the German economy through the four-year plan had by this point been largely taken over by others, particularly Albert Speer, who became armaments minister in 1942 and effectively sidelined Göring from economic management. Göring attended fewer meetings about production and resources, and when he did participate, his contributions were often unhelpful or counterproductive. His reputation for corruption and incompetence meant that other Nazi leaders increasingly ignored him or worked around him. Hitler himself became openly contemptuous of Göring, making cutting remarks about his failures and his drug addiction. Yet Hitler never formally removed Göring from his positions, partly out of residual loyalty to his old comrade, and partly because Göring was still officially the designated successor, though by late war it was clear this succession would never happen. Göring's daily routine in the final year of the war, from mid-1944 to April 1945, was characterized by almost complete detachment from reality. He left Karen Hall as Allied forces approached and moved to southern Germany, with portions of his art collection and other treasures. He held virtually no meaningful meetings about military matters, as the Luftwaffe had been destroyed as an effective force, and there was nothing left to command. He spent his days drinking, taking drugs, sleeping, and obsessing about his art collection and his legacy. He made half-hearted attempts to maintain his position in the Nazi hierarchy, but other leaders ignored him. In Hitler's final weeks in the Berlin bunker, Göring was not invited to join him, a clear indication of how far he had fallen from his former status as Hitler's heir apparent. In late April 1945, Göring made his final miscalculation. Receiving word that Hitler was trapped in Berlin and might be incapacitated, Göring sent a telegram asking if he should assume leadership of the Reich, according to Hitler's 1941 decree, naming him as successor. Hitler, influenced by Martin Bormann, who hated Göring, interpreted this as treachery and betrayal. Hitler stripped Göring of all ranks and positions and ordered his arrest. Göring was placed under house arrest by the SS, though he was not executed as some in Hitler's bunker demanded. This ignominious end to Göring's Nazi career came just days before Hitler's suicide and Germany's surrender. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Göring was captured by American forces. Initially, he seemed to relish the attention, expecting to be treated as an important prisoner and imagining he might play some role in post-war negotiations. He was detoxified from his drug addiction during his captivity, lost substantial weight, and actually became more mentally sharp than he had been in years. However, he soon realized that instead of being treated as a negotiating partner, he would be tried as a war criminal. At the Nuremberg trials, Göring was the most prominent defendant. His daily routine in prison and during the trial was vastly different from his previous life of luxury. He woke in a sparse cell under guard, ate prison food, and spent his days in the courtroom facing accusations of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. During the Nuremberg trial from November 1945 to October 1946, Göring's daily routine was structured by the court schedule. He would be transported each day from his cell to the courtroom, where he sat in the defendant's dock, listening to testimony and evidence of Nazi crimes. Göring attempted to dominate the defendants, organizing their responses and attempting to mount a collective defense of the Nazi regime. He was the most effective of the defendants in the witness box, intelligent and articulate despite his crimes, and he attempted to defend Nazi actions while denying personal knowledge of the worst atrocities, particularly the Holocaust. His testimony was mendacious and self-serving, but it demonstrated that when forced to focus, Göring retained considerable ability. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming, including documents showing his direct involvement in establishing concentration camps, in economic exploitation and looting, in planning aggressive war, and in persecution of Jews. On October 1, 1946, Göring was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death by hanging. His daily routine in his final weeks consisted of waiting in his cell, writing letters and memoirs, and preparing for execution. However, Göring was determined to control his own death rather than be hanged, which he considered an dishonorable way for a soldier to die. On the night of October 15, 1946, just hours before his scheduled execution, Göring committed suicide by taking a cyanide capsule he had somehow managed to keep hidden throughout his imprisonment. How he obtained and concealed the capsule remains somewhat mysterious, though it likely involved bribery or assistance from guards. His death cheated the hangman, but did not alter the historical verdict on his crimes and his role in the Nazi regime. So what did Hermann Göring actually do all day? The answer changed dramatically over time. In the mid-1930s, he worked energetically building the Luftwaffe, managing the German economy through the four-year plan, and fulfilling multiple Nazi leadership roles, though even then combining genuine administrative work with corruption and self-enrichment. He held meetings about aircraft production, strategic planning, economic policy, and numerous other matters. He entertained guests and foreign dignitaries. He collected art and built his estates using state resources. He went hunting and attended cultural events. He played politics within the Nazi hierarchy, expanding his power and influence while enriching himself. As the war began, his days included military briefings and command responsibilities for the Luftwaffe, though he increasingly delegated actual work to subordinates. He continued his art collecting, entertaining, and pursuit of pleasure, even as war demands should have required total dedication to military matters. By the Middle War years of 1942 to 1944, Göring's daily routine had deteriorated into a combination of minimal engagement with his official duties and maximum indulgence in his vices. He would hold occasional meetings about Luftwaffe matters, receive briefings that he often ignored or misunderstood due to his drug-addled state, and make occasional visits to units or facilities. But most of his time was spent sleeping late, taking drugs, eating and drinking excessively, looting art on a massive scale, playing with his model trains, avoiding Hitler and other Nazi leaders who were disgusted by his failures, and generally retreating into fantasy and hedonism as a psychological escape from the catastrophic situation he had helped create. In the final year of the war, Göring barely functioned in any official capacity. His days were spent in drug-induced stupor, obsessing about his art collection, moving his treasures to safe locations as Allied forces advanced, eating and drinking despite shortages that affected ordinary Germans, and generally living in a delusional bubble, isolated from the reality of Germany's impending defeat. His brief flurry of activity in late April 1945, attempting to assert his succession rights, ended in his arrest and the final destruction of his position in the Nazi hierarchy. During his imprisonment and trial, Göring's days were structured by captivity and legal proceedings. He woke in a prison cell, attended court sessions where his crimes were documented, attempted to defend himself and the Nazi regime through testimony and arguments, and returned to his cell to await judgment. In his final weeks after conviction, his days consisted of waiting for execution while writing and preparing his suicide. The trajectory of Göring's daily life, from energetic administrator to drug-addled recluse to convicted war criminal, illustrates several broader themes about Nazi Germany and about power and its corruption. Göring's early effectiveness showed that the Nazi regime, despite its evil ends, did contain some individuals capable of administrative achievement, building institutions like the Luftwaffe that were formidable though ultimately used for criminal purposes. His gradual deterioration illustrated how power, without accountability, combined with personal weakness and vice, leads to catastrophic failure. His corruption and looting demonstrated how Nazi ideology's celebration of power and racial superiority led directly to criminal exploitation on a massive scale. His final years of fantasy and denial showed how perpetrators of great crimes often retreat into psychological mechanisms that allow them to avoid confronting the consequences of their actions. Göring's daily life also revealed the profound hypocrisy at the heart of Nazi leadership. While Nazi ideology celebrated sacrifice, discipline, and martial virtue, and while Nazi propaganda demanded that ordinary Germans accept privation for the war effort, Göring lived in obscene luxury, indulging every appetite while Germans starved and died. While the regime claimed to represent German honor and greatness, Göring engaged in systematic looting and theft that violated every principle of honor. While Nazi leaders presented themselves as men of action and decision, Göring spent his days playing with toy trains and hiding from responsibility. The contrast between Nazi propaganda and the reality of how Nazi leaders actually lived their daily lives could not be more stark. In conclusion, what Hermann Göring actually did all day evolved from genuine, if morally corrupted, administrative work, building Germany's air force and managing its economy through increasingly ineffective military leadership during the early war years, to near-total retreat into drug addiction, hedonism, and fantasy during the later war years, finally ending in imprisonment and trial as a war criminal. His daily routine encompassed meetings and decisions about aircraft production and military strategy, diplomatic entertainments and political maneuvering, systematic looting of Europe's art treasures, playing with model trains and indulging in food and drink, hunting and showing off his estates, avoiding accountability for catastrophic failures, and ultimately facing justice at Nuremberg, where his past actions were judged by history. Göring's days reflected both his genuine abilities and his profound moral failures, his capacity for administrative achievement and his descent into corruption and vice, his former position as Hitler's heir, and his final status as a disgraced drug addict awaiting execution. Understanding what Göring actually did all day provides insight into how Nazi Germany functioned, how power corrupts, and how individuals of ability can nonetheless become instruments of evil and ultimately failures when their ambition is unmoored from any ethical foundation.